Now on 4, the first in a 3-part series about the car. Tonight's programme contains scenes of car crashes which some viewers may find disturbing.
The car is 1 century old. In that time, it has changed the world, changed the way we live, where we live, transformed the face of our towns and countryside. It has been a wonderful, liberating invention. But it has also brought untold grief. 25 million dead around the world, and rising. It took half a century to realize this. Now we're attempting to curb the car's insatiable appetite for human life, to put the tiger back in its tank. The Mercedes S-Class is one of the biggest and strongest cars in the world. It's also one of the safest. But in Paris, on August the 31st, 1997, none of this was enough to prevent 3 of its occupants dying in the most notorious car crash of all time. Millions of words have been written about the events leading up to and following this accident. But apart from the identity of the victims, the stark reality was that faced by many of us each day. In a car crash, who lives and who dies, and why? Professor Murray Mackay, Britain's leading car crash investigator, is in Paris to find out what happened in that quarter of a second in which 3 people died.
According to the accident investigators, this is where the accident began. About 20 past midnight, the Mercedes is coming along this road on the left bank of the Seine towards the Alma Bridge. It heads down towards the underpass, and it's estimated at that time it speeds about 70 miles an hour. What happens next is based on the evidence that we have so far. As he comes down into the tunnel, he's faced with a slow-moving Fiat. He steers to the left. Because he's just come over a crest, the steering's light, he probably puts in too much steering, so he's heading towards the center columns. He corrects right, and now he's heading directly for the Fiat Uno.
The Mercedes sideswiped the Fiat, snapping off its own driving mirror and smashing the Fiat's tail light. So far, just a minor collision.
Was the Fiat just an innocent motorist returning late at night, or was there something more sinister than that? We may never know. The French police have given up the search for that vehicle. What we do know is that at this time in the accident sequence, the actions of the driver of the Mercedes were not those of somebody who was normal and alert.
A 106-foot skid mark shows that the Mercedes driver pulled the steering wheel back to the left. Then the car mounted the pavement and smashed head-on into column 13. The car spun round and ended up facing in the direction it had come from. It's thought that the Fiat drove by without stopping.
Speed, a driver under the influence of alcohol, the unexpected encounter with the Fiat, these all played their part. But you must remember that from the time the car entered the tunnel until it came to rest after the impact, that's only about 2 seconds. Newspapers have talked luridly of speeds of 120 miles an hour, but looking at the damage tells a very different story. It suggests an impact with the pillar of about 60 miles an hour, and we know that the car came to rest about 15 feet from the pillar, spinning out, and that means about 10 miles an hour exit speed from the pillar. So the change in velocity was slightly less than 50 miles an hour, and it's that change in velocity which is crucial in terms of the severity of the crash to which the occupants were exposed. This was a severe but a survivable accident, and what we now need to consider is why did 3 people die? Strangely, Princess Diana, sitting where I am in the right rear, had the best chance of survival because the impact was concentrated on the left front of the car, and as it hit the pillar, it also rotated and span out, so she went partly past the pillar and didn't have quite the same crash forces applied to her as happened to the people sitting on the left. If she'd been wearing a seatbelt, she'd have had a fair chance of surviving even this extreme accident. But unbelted, she was thrown forward to strike the back of the front passenger seat, the door pillar, and then was tossed around after the main accident took place and the vehicle span out. There's one more thing that's obvious, that, you know, belted or unbelted, with almost total probability, if there'd been a guardrail fitted in this tunnel, then all of the occupants would probably have survived. The guardrail would have deflected the car along the line of the highway, there would have been no heavy hit, and the forces would have been survivable.
The tunnel is one of the few in Paris with unguarded columns, despite the fact that it is one of the main thoroughfares of the city. 8 people have died here in 15 years.
You know, the driver's been blamed, the paparazzi have been blamed, there's been suggestions even that Princess Diana was blamed for not wearing her seatbelt. But what is clearly obvious to me is the responsibility of the French authorities. You have a design here that's more appropriate for the horse and carriage age. If you'd spent £10 per foot on a guardrail, 3 more people would be alive today. With this tragic accident, what we're showing is we're pushing the levels of survivability with car safety. It shows how far we've come, but it also shows in the wider aspects of safety how much further we have to go.
"40 years ago, car safety was the last thing on anyone's mind. In the 50s and 60s, America was on top of the world, and so was the American car, literally. In an excess of zeal, an enterprising advertising man helicoptered a Chevrolet, complete with glamorous model, onto a mountaintop to show that it towered above the opposition.
Chevrolet.
Then the wind got up. The terrified model couldn't be got down and was left alone on the bare mountain in a gale. It was claimed that she'd suffered a breakdown from the incident. A lawsuit was narrowly avoided. But that was the only tarnish on what was the golden age of the automobile.
Here you are, 1 mini cheeseburger.
Thank you. Let me tell you about the 50s. I love the 50s. I love my friends, I love the music, and I love the cars of the 50s. To me, it was the excitement of all time. To have these beautiful, beautiful cars that I could see, that I could touch, that I could smell, that I could feel, that I could drive.
To Americans in the 50s and 60s, anything seemed possible. The country was rich and the living was easy.
We had that freewheeling attitude in this country. We'd go anywhere, do anything, just take on the whole country, and the cars looked like that, and I think that the shapes and forms that we were dealing with, it was probably a great expression of the way people felt, the way they dressed, the way we lived, the way we acted. I think it was a reflection of the theater and the kind of movies we saw in those days. Our whole culture, I think, was really pretty much explained with the types of automobiles we drove.
It was an American dream which the rest of the world was anxious to share.
For on this magnificent road, the speed which can easily be reached is so great that senses may be numbed and judgment warped.
In Britain, the first motorways were opening, modelled on the American freeways. Such a novelty that crowds would stand there for hours, just watching the cars go by. For the first time, British motorists could put their foot down and feel the wind of change in their hair. It was all a bit strange to begin with.
If you overshoot the turning point, don't try to do this. Reversing and turning on the motorway is an offence which could cost you £20 in a magistrate's court. If you miss your turning, you must continue along the motorway to the next exit. This is also an offence. Motorways are for motoring, not for parking and picnic parties.
There was so much pent-up demand for cars after the lean years of war and rationing. People were desperate for anything on four wheels.
It was easy. I mean, everybody wanted the product. You didn't chase the people, they chased you. Bless my soul. If a client actually asked to see what was under the bonnet, we salesmen would be horrified. They'd probably know more about it than we would.
Gosh, your new Austin Cambridge is really super duper, James. Yeah, like a ride. We're just off.
They were buying freedom. They wanted to get out. They wanted to go down to the seaside with the kids. They wanted to go and see Granny at the weekend. Safety? We knew the cars would stop. We knew they'd steer well. I can't remember ever talking to anybody about safety in the terms we do today. They certainly never asked us, thank goodness.
The full horror of what was happening on the roads was unknown to most, merely glimpsed by a few.
I began to examine the safety records in this country. I found that we were killing about 45,000 people per year in auto accidents. It's roughly the same number as were killed in total during the 13 years of the Vietnam War. And yet at the time, in the early 1950s, it was thought very little could be done about that.
In Britain, just as in America, the growing realization that all was not well with the world.
In the late part of the 50s and the early 60s, we became aware really quite rapidly that road accidents were really a very major part of our work. And in fact, the word carnage is not too dramatic for that. It seems on some days that that's all we did.
Are you ready?
No.
No? Here we go. There's that.
The effect on the staff was a feeling of almost hopelessness, that nothing could be done to stop this.
The motor car knock you over?
We very soon became aware that the whole culture in this and other countries was that the car was simply too precious, and consumer groups, civil liberties groups, road organisations were very, very deeply against and very effectively against any changes that would actually reduce what was clearly carnage. And that was very distressing for us. It seemed that the car was just too important to everybody's life.
People were dying in road crashes at as little as 10 miles per hour. What was going on? Professor Murray Mackay of Birmingham University set up one of the world's first accident research teams to find out. These car graveyards became his second home.
I've always been interested in cars. I'm trained as a mechanical engineer. Both of my parents were doctors, so I grew up in a house where the human body and injuries was a everyday dinner table conversation, and that's how I got interested in the biomechanics of injuries. I wasn't interested in what caused the accident. I was interested in the features inside the car, designed into the car, that were killing and injuring people. And this was something that the manufacturers were really not interested in. The whole focus of the thinking at that time, traditionally, was in preventing accidents taking place, doing something about the nut behind the wheel, doing something about driving standards and education. And the idea of crash protection, crash worthiness in cars, was a totally new idea.
In the United States, these mechanical mausoleums were haunted by another sort of investigator. Product liability laws had brought experts like Byron Block looking for design flaws in cars that had killed or injured clients. His evidence would be used in court.
This is a 1956 Buick made by General Motors, and this is just like a car that my family owned in the 1950s. Let me show you some of the real safety hazards in this car. And this was typical of tens of millions of cars produced throughout the 1950s. First of all, the steering column is just like a harpoon. It'll ram into your chest, and to further aggravate that problem, look at the knife-like blades of the steering wheel that also will serve to cut into your chest and your neck and your face in a frontal crash. Remember, the car had no seat belts, so invariably you're going to go forward in a frontal crash, and this was lethal. Also, the ignition switch, the key that goes into that, typically would slice into a driver's kneecap, would shatter the kneecap, but very lethal. Many other knobs and protrusions in the car would also punch holes in people in frontal crashes. This padded instrument panel at least was a token recognition that safety was important, but beneath the very thin padding was a rigid metal edge, and that would do the damage. So it was a feeble effort at best. The rear view mirror is another wonderful design of the 50s. In a frontal crash, you would go forward, break the mirror, leaving a rigid metal spike rigidly attached, and it would split your skull open and you'd die. Another stupid design was the glove box door, which would pop open in a crash and serve as a guillotine, a knife-like edge that would slice into a child's neck. All of these features were found in just about all the cars of the 50s. These were secret defects, secret hazards. The public had no idea that these were killers hiding in their car.
These were the men who ran the biggest, the fastest growing, most exciting industry of all. They worked for Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, the greatest corporations on the planet. From their corporate headquarters in Detroit, they effectively ran the world's car industries. Here, talk of accidents and death was anathema. It destroyed the romance and mystique of motoring, threatened the ever-rising car sales. But in 1956, one man was about to step out of line. The head of Ford at that time was the young whiz kid, Robert McNamara. One day, he received a visit from some scientists from Cornell University. They were working on the novel idea of saving lives by packaging the occupants of cars like a carton of eggs. The trouble was, they had no money.
They were operating on a shoestring. You won't believe this, but in carrying out their packaging experiments, they were literally dropping human skulls, packaged in different ways, down the stairwells of Cornell's student dormitories. That was their lab. The amount of money they needed might have been on the order of a few $100,000. And Ford agreed to contribute, I've forgotten what, but let's say $100,000 or $200,000. Chrysler put in a few tens of thousands. GM refused.
Impressed with the Cornell research, McNamara put the first safety cars on the road. By today's standards, they weren't much, but in 1956, it was almost heresy.
Optional lifeguard padding on the instrument panel and sun visors of the 1956 Ford. Ford offers this padding because statistics show 38% of accident injuries to front seat passengers are caused by being thrown forward against hard interior surfaces. You can also have these optional nylon seat belts, 1/3 stronger than airline requirements. All these safety features add up to exclusive lifeguard design, a Ford first for safety first.
As the 1956 models rolled off the line, Ford management received a phone call. It was from General Motors, the giant of the industry. A senior executive there was demanding that Ford drop McNamara's safety campaign. It could damage car sales. Such was the might of General Motors, the warning was taken seriously.
GM feared it would lead to a reduction in automotive sales. It sounds absurd to you. It certainly sounded absurd to me. But they believed it so strongly, they put tremendous pressure on Ford to force a reduction in our emphasis on safety. They thought it would take the romance, if you will, out of car buying. Insane.
And here is Ford's new lifeguard steering wheel. Watch what happens when these two tangle. What a wallop! But he wasn't injured. because the steering wheel cushioned the shock.
And his body never touched the steering post.
The campaign was scrapped. McNamara left to become Secretary of Defense and to wage war in Vietnam. In Detroit, the old order was restored. It would be nearly 2 decades before anyone tried anything like that again.
Can we make it? That's always a very important thing. And how you're going to make it? Just get down and put something on the paper, which I'm trying to do right now.
In Britain, the biggest change in our motoring history was just taking shape.
Everything was in utmost secrecy. No one was allowed into, apart from those few who were working on it, no one's allowed into the department at all. If you try and finish drawing it, you might recognise it. It's a Mini.
The Mini, the so-called car of the century. It was designed by Alec Issigonis, the most charismatic and cantankerous car designer in Britain.
Issigonis had got that many ideas so fast. It was a bit of a job to keep up with him. It was a challenge, but he always insisted on the word elegance. Style to him was a bit of an anathema, I think. A car was a functional instrument, like a hammer.
John Shepherd was responsible for putting flesh and blood into Issigonis's wildest idea. A car with the engine set sideways, driving the front wheels, which were tiny, and placed at the corners of the car to maximize interior room. The Mini was designed at a time of petrol rationing and was meant as a rival to foreign bubble cars. Reporters were expecting a town runabout, a shopping bag on wheels, but at the press launch they found they had a racing car on their hands.
We were watching these press people going around, very daintily they were going, and I said, come on, let's show them what we can do with this thing. And we took one of them each, whipped it around the thing, go to the corner, back again, but 3 laps there, put the wheels back in the pound there, and walked away. As we walked away, Issigonis has obviously seen us do it, and he came and gave us a bottlicking for it. But damage had been done. Press people seen what we were doing. Of course, they're going to beat us. Off they went. Back and forth. All I know is those 10 cars all needed a complete new set of tyres running around there. They ripped a lot off.
The Mini was truly revolutionary. It stood for everything that was best in British design. But it also inherited the vices of most other small British cars of that era, even exaggerated them because of its size. Certain injuries began to repeat themselves over and over again, and Professor Mackay's new accident research team began to find out why.
Supposing you have a rollover accident at night time. In this car you've got the filler neck to the fuel tank that's sticking out a long way. So in a roll it just gets sheared off. You've got free fuel coming out, you've got an electrical source, you've got a fire, you get lots of people burnt to death. And here you've got a door latch design, which is just like a door latch in a house, so that if the side of the car gets stretched, the door will just swing open, people will be ejected, they'll get fatal and serious head and neck injuries from landing on the ground. You've got a seat that is just attached at the front, it hinges, nothing to hold it down at the back, so that people in the rear will come shooting forward, the people in the front will be crushed by the weight of the occupants behind. You've got a really short nose on the vehicle, so that in a frontal impact, the engine comes back, the transverse bulkhead comes back, you get really serious disabling injuries to the feet and the ankles and the lower legs from that design. So I said some fairly unpleasant things about this little car in the local press and elsewhere, and I had a summons to go to Longbridge to see Alec Issigonis, the designer of the car. And he was a dominant senior engineer at the time. He put me on the carpet in front of his desk, and he said, young man, I design my cars that have got such good brakes, such good steering and handling, that if somebody gets into a crash, it's their own fault. And I thought this was a particularly stupid approach to have, and I told him in no uncertain terms what I thought, so we had a good stand-up row about it. And of course, one of the things that happened, you know, to the Mini was that it couldn't meet the early safety standards in North America. It had to be withdrawn, and thus it was a failure because there was no market for it in the best market in the world.
Millions were spent on correcting those early problems and making sure the Mini meets today's safety standards. 40 years on, it's become one of the world's top-selling cars of all time.
The history in this case is a combination of criminal irresponsibility and innocent death.
By 1960, the accident rate was out of control. In America alone, the death toll had risen to an unprecedented 50,000 a year.
He had no excuse. He never will have one, for a family left motherless through no fault of her own.
Sickened by scenes such as these, a 21-year-old Princeton student began writing about car safety.
I used to hitchhike a great deal, and one time I saw a particularly gruesome crash where the head of a young child had been decapitated, and I realized that the sharp edge of the glove compartment door was the instrument.
The student was the son of Lebanese immigrants. His name was Ralph Nader. These were the opening words of his university thesis.
For over half a century, the automobile has brought death, injury, and inestimable sorrow and deprivation to millions of people.
When a publisher wanted a book written on road safety, a journalist suggested Nader. His university thesis became Unsafe at Any Speed, the book which was to devastate the car industry. It sold millions and made Nader a household name. The car industry was God. No one had dared to criticize it before. Like David facing Goliath, Nader took on the might of General Motors and one of its most popular cars, the Corvair.
The Corvair was a uniquely unstable car. It had its engine in the rear, and it had a suspension system that on cornering maneuvers induced the wheels to tuck under, as the saying was, and to destabilize it and to roll over the car. You had to be an extraordinarily skilled driver to anticipate something like this, or a very lucky driver. I thought to lead the book, Unsafe at Any Speed, with the Corvair was a proper attention grabber and a proper signal that there were going to be names named, company names and make and models named.
Unsafe at Any Speed came out in November 1965. Within days, Nader received an invitation from General Motors to go to Detroit.
I was offered a job twice by a vice president saying, why don't you come to work for GM and put your ideas to work? They were trying to feel me out, see whether I was for sale. And little did I know that at the time that they had hired a private detective to get dirt on me in order to discredit me. And several private detectives tailing me around the country. They set women to accost me and to try to get me in compromising situations. And they followed me down to the U.S. Senate office building in Washington.
Inside the Senate office building, the private detectives lost sight of Nader and hunted the corridors with increasing urgency. Finally, they approached a guard, asking if he'd seen Nader. The guard, suspicious, demanded their credentials. The cat was out of the bag. As Nader was a witness in the ongoing Senate hearings into car safety, the incident was seen not only as an outrage, but a crime. the General Motors president came to the Senate to give a grudging apology.
I am not here to excuse, condone, or justify in any way our investigating Mr. Nader. To the extent that General Motors bears responsibility, I want to apologize here and now to the members of this subcommittee and Mr. Nader.
It was a turning point. President Johnson signed new laws to control the car makers. The industry that could do no wrong now found itself accused of a callous disregard for human life.
Over the Labor Day weekend, 29 American servicemen died in Vietnam. During the same Labor Day weekend, 614 Americans died on our highways in automobile accidents. 29 on the battlefield, 614 on the highways. In this century, more than 1,500,000 of our fellow citizens have died on our streets and our highways. Nearly 3 times as many Americans as we've lost in all of our wars.
It triggered a quarter of a century of conflict with the industry that had previously called all the shots. Nader had started the age of consumerism, the organized revolt of those who felt themselves helpless in the face of massive corporations. And it all came to a head in the mid-70s.
When I bought my Pinto, I figured it was a good value, but I didn't know how good until my dad started borrowing it.
So I ended up buying my own.
Then I bought one, and I bought one.
And I bought one.
And we bought 2.
Join the Pinto family.
This is the famous Pinto emblem that appeared in magazines and newspapers. This is the famous Pinto shape. But what made the Pinto truly infamous was the rear end. And that's where the fuel tank is located. And as you see, it is very close to the rear bumper, and in a rear impact, it gets crushed against the rear axle. The tank gets punctured, ruptured, fuel gets ignited, and there are infernos that have burned up people over the years.
Dozens of people were burnt in Pinto accidents, but the most notorious case was that of Richard Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company in California.
Richard Grimshaw was a young boy, and he was a passenger in a Pinto that was rear impacted, ironically enough, by another Ford. The car burst into flames, and Richard Grimshaw had his face melted, his body melted, his hands and fingers melted. It was a tragedy beyond belief.
Byron Block set out to get evidence for the trial, examining burnt-out Pintos. But it was a document that he unearthed that was to be the most telling of all. A Ford letter setting out the case for doing nothing about the problem with the gas tank. The document estimated that 180 people would probably burn to death and another 180 have serious injuries, which would cost the company nearly $50 million in damages. But the cost of fixing the cars, at $11 a time, could come to $137 million.
Therefore, Ford argued, it was cheaper to let them burn. And it was that corporate attitude that convinced the jury to award $125 million in punitive damages as punishment to Ford Motor Company for that attitude of trading off human lives for a few dollars of profit.
The Pinto case was a landmark, exposing the automobile industry's commercial cynicism. The warning sped around the world's car makers. From now on, safety could not be ignored. When the quest began to make cars safer, no one had a clear idea how to do it. Little was known about the effects of an impact on the human body, what the driver could withstand. To find out, a seemingly lunatic experiment was carried out in the New Mexico desert by the U.S. Air Force in 1954. Scientist John Stapp strapped himself onto a rocket sled, to boldly go where no man had gone before.
He started the countdown.
10, 9.
Adrenaline comes in and the heart begins to beat a little faster. Then just as he reaches 0, you get this enormous ram against your back and feel totally helpless. You're being given the biggest kick that could be delivered.
Stapp had been propelled at a speed of 632 miles per hour and stopped in 1.4 seconds. No one has ever undergone such a test before or since.
I couldn't see anything, and I was looking around, and I was beginning to think about seeing-eyed dogs and white canes. And I was thinking to myself, now I've paid my dues. I've gotten there. I've shown them what they want to know. And from now on, life is going to be good.
John Stapp had tested the limits of human endurance and shown that, properly strapped in, a driver could survive almost unimaginable forces. 6,000 miles away, Swedish engineers were going to work on an egg and were coming up with the same answer. The three-point seatbelt, introduced by Volvo in 1959. Volvo patented the device, but allowed everyone else to use it free of charge.
Inside the car, without belts, we all tumbled about like popcorn.
The first seat belts were accompanied by a huge publicity campaign. The adverts were chilling. The crashes were spectacular. They had no effect whatsoever.
Well, really, almost nobody I know wears seatbelts. That's the truth.
I find it inconvenient.
I don't see where you need them, really, to drive carefully.
I don't like to feel so tied down. Mostly they're a pain in the neck.
The horror on the roads would not go away. In 1967, the British government acted. A bill to make the wearing of seatbelts compulsory. There was an outcry, the start of a 16-year battle, the biggest safety issue of the 20th century. Many regarded it as an invasion of their rights.
Any intrusion into civil liberties was not going to be condoned by the people. These were things to be guarded. Perhaps in those early days there was a feeling of, damn you, I'll go to the devil my own way. I am master of my own destiny. If I don't want to wear a seatbelt and get flung out of my car and killed, that's my responsibility.
Go on blowing, sister.
All the propaganda was to no avail. The casualties continued to pour in, with no end in sight. 9 times the law came before Parliament. 9 times it was thrown out.
300 mils of soda Vic.
In the hospital emergency wards, the situation was grim.
Anything palpable in these vessels?
I can well remember a young child who travelled in the front seat of a parent's car early one evening to go and buy something for supper, the English dish of fish and chips, and there was a collision, local street, low traffic speed and so forth, but a collision sufficient to throw her through the windscreen of that car because seatbelts were not in vogue in those days. She was brought here, had instantly lost the sight of both eyes, and it was unsavable. The trauma for that child was huge, and it would affect her for the whole of her life.
Britain's motorists felt someone was taking a liberty, and that someone was a woman.
To have a woman come along and tell them they must wear a seatbelt was intolerable. I used to get angry, almost life-threatening letters from indignant men who deeply resented having a woman Minister of Transport, particularly as that woman did not drive herself. They were having a love affair with their cars, weren't they? And the bigger and more beautiful, the better.
This was the new great release, the great opportunity, the great purchase that young men were going to make. They wanted to be free. They didn't want a lot of rules and regulations. It was certainly not proposed by a woman, that's for sure. Barbara Castle, damn it, a woman impinging upon the motor car and the motor car business. Oh dear, that wasn't a good thing.
In the end, children were the key. No one could bear scenes like these, of children injured and suffering. So when a law was proposed forcing children to be strapped in, even the most die-hard opponents couldn't say no. When it was shown to have saved lives, the opposition crumbled. In 1983, wearing a seatbelt became compulsory for everyone in Britain. Straight away, road deaths fell by a quarter. It was to be the most successful safety device ever invented.
Nag yourself to remember this drill. Clunk the car door and click the seatbelt. Clunk, click, every trip.
The British may have been conquered, but Americans were to prove a much tougher proposition. Only 1 in 20 of them bothered to wear a seatbelt. Millions were spent trying to persuade them, all to no avail.
What's the first thing that goes through your mind in a head-on if you're not wearing a safety belt?
The steering wheel. All in favor of wearing safety belts, raise your hand.
You could learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belt.
But then, miraculously, the problem was solved. A wonderful new device, the airbag. For Americans, this was the ultimate panacea. No longer would it matter if a driver wore his seatbelt or not. The bag would save him regardless. Early tests envisaged the new wonder bag on the front bumpers of cars, even in aeroplanes. There seemed no limit to the places where one could appear. By the early 70s, the first car manufacturer was ready.
This is a 1973 Chevrolet. It's the world's first production airbag car made by General Motors. It has an airbag for the driver and an airbag for the right front passenger as well. If we had had these kind of airbags all these years, this last quarter of a century, all of the cars you see around us in this wrecking yard, most of those drivers and passengers in the front seat would have walked away instead of being killed or horribly injured.
But Chevrolet abandoned their airbag 1 year later, claiming that the customers didn't want it. When the American government proposed making the bags compulsory, the industry fought tooth and nail. It would be the last great safety battle of the 20th century. The car makers were led by the giant personality of Lee Iacocca, the boss of Ford. Iacocca even went to the White House to harangue the government, claiming these airbags are killing our profits. He persuaded them to delay the legislation. When Iacocca moved on to Chrysler, he continued the fight from there.
We're not doing anything on airbags because we don't believe in them. I haven't believed in them for 2 decades because of all the problems.
But Iacocca was about to have the rug pulled from under him. In 1984, under pressure from Ralph Nader, the agency responsible for purchasing all government cars stipulated airbags. To everyone's amazement, Ford broke ranks, bid for the contract, and started installing airbags as quickly as possible. Iacocca was left wrong-footed by this move, but not for long.
Ford, GM, and Honda won't have airbags in all their cars until 1994. By that time, approximately 60,000 airbags will have deployed in Chrysler-built vehicles.
Chrysler were going to install more airbags more quickly than anyone else in the world.
I couldn't believe it. This car started coming right at me. I stood on the brakes and bam!
Airbags were suddenly a commercial proposition, and Iacocca their #1 fan.
There's the airbag in my lap.
It saved her life.
Chrysler puts an airbag in every car we build in the U.S. Japanese automakers don't. An airbag can make a real difference. Right, Ron?
That's right.
With the capitulation of the industry's chief opponent of airbags, the war was over. By 1990, every manufacturer was racing to install as many as possible. But the problems everyone had been aware of back in the 70s had not gone away. 6-year-old Kyle Lehman. His mother made this home video of Kyle graduating from his nursery class. Her son is now one of the central characters in the most controversial safety issue facing Americans.
We were leaving the house to go to swim lessons, and Kyle was strapped in the front seat, and Cody was in the Bagnus car seat. We took a gravel road, and going around the curve, we hit head-on with another vehicle, and the airbags inflated. I just remember the real loud sound in my head, feeling funny, and the smell, and it was quiet. And I got Cody out of the car, because after I got out, Cody was crying, and I got him out of the car. And then it was quiet. And all I remember is Kyle from the neck up, the mark on his neck. And he was dead. I just remember my baby being dead.
It's an American tragedy. Whilst nearly all Europeans belt up now, 1/3 of all Americans still won't. So their airbags have to be powerful enough to stop an unbelted adult. The American bag explodes at up to 210 miles an hour. A child leaning forward to adjust the radio or sitting on the edge of their seat, as children often do, is in mortal danger. Up-to-date airbags have killed some 131 Americans, most of them children. But this tragedy has tended to conceal the fact that in the 1990s, something remarkable has happened in automobile safety. Safety was an issue whose time had come.
Who knows what trials life will throw at you? So for your protection, every Corsa has a rigid steel safety cell.
Volvo's technologically advanced side impact protection system.
Crumple zones, front and rear, and twin side impact bars in all doors.
The word now is safety sells.
The Volvo 340, tested by dummies, driven by the intelligent.
Billions have been poured in. Every company now has its own safety division, jostling for preeminence with engineering and styling. It's a bizarre, high-tech business where cars are now crashed without so much as a scratch. A Renault encounters a carelessly mislaid concrete block.
We've seen a real sea change in terms of the acceptance of crash performance and safety design by the manufacturers. And this has come about, I think, because people are a lot more aware of it. They want to be protected and they're willing to pay for it. Safety now sells cars. So it's here to stay. And in the future, we're going to see a tremendous amount of better safety coming into vehicles.
We've come a long way in 30 years. Our cars are much safer now. However, it's a success story without a happy ending. Despite the fact that it's now more difficult to kill yourself than ever before, more people do. The trend in road deaths is once again on the way up. There is strong evidence that the more engineers do to make road travel safe, the more dangerously we drive. We've fixed the car, but can we ever fix the driver?
Armed and extremely dangerous, a posse with a violent intent are on the run in tonight's film, Next.
Just before the film, car safety is a matter of life and death in Crash.
There she blows. A lovely day to drive in again. Well, I've been a driving instructor for 20 years and I've never been scared once. No, I've been scared 243,629 times. Which coincidentally is the same amount of driving lessons I've given. I feel myself that today's people out there, today's motorists, feel like, you know, when they get in their car, it's a bit like putting on a suit of armour. And they get behind the wheel and then they're ready for battle. And some people's characters change considerably. As pedestrians, they're really kind and considerate people. Always kisses the wife goodbye, never kicks the dog. And if they see an old lady wanting to cross the road, like there's one over there, then they're happy to help her across. But what happens when he gets behind the wheel? He suddenly becomes really aggressive, and there's the same old lady going back the other way now. And what the hell's she doing on the road? Shouldn't be allowed out on their own. And there he is, tooting and getting quite aggressive.
When a person is driving an automobile, there's a sense of complete control. It responds without a moment's hesitation to whatever we tell it to do, even to its own demise, even to our own demise. There's no other situation in our lives where that happens, and we love it.
It's a daily routine for over 1 billion of us. Something we take completely for granted. The car is essential to most of our lives. It's the means of transport that worries us the least, but carries the greatest danger. 25 million people have been killed on the world's roads. Accidents are the price of the freedom to drive.
Deaths on the road are a function of speed and a function of massive lumps of metal and a function of fairly known fallibilities of individuals, both in the lumps of metal and actually crossing the roads as well as pedestrians. All that's fairly well known. We know that human beings fail, they make mistakes, they make poor judgments. So if you stick such faulty bits of apparatus into 1-ton lumps of metal and rush them round at speeds of 70 miles an hour and more, one can expect these disasters to happen.
The driver in the red car escaped unhurt. Just another near miss. Was it skill that saved him? Did the car keep him alive? Or was it simply luck? What happens next? Is this bad luck or bad driving? Are crashes inevitable? Do we prize the idea of getting there above everything else? When things go wrong, drivers blame the roads, the car, the weather, even fate. But hard evidence shows they're wrong. 96% of accidents are caused by driver error.
The car is a big, powerful weapon. It's exactly the same as a gun. If you put a gun in somebody's hands, you're going to change their personality. You're going to affect what they are capable of. You put someone behind the wheel of a car, it's exactly the same. First of all, I mean, they're capable of going at 100 miles an hour, which they never would without the car. But also, they're capable of destroying somebody, crushing someone, ripping them to pieces, just by a little move of the wheel.
Despite safety cages, seat belts and airbags, cocooned in their cars, drivers still die in crashes. On the road, there is no such thing as invulnerability.
And at these traffic lights, we're going to turn right, so mirror, a couple of flashes, make sure everyone's seen them before we start to move over, and we glide over, not even touching the cat's eyes. I must be the ultimate driver.
In America, there are 20 million road accidents a year. Yet there are so many cars and so much driving that fatalities seem rare. You can drive for a lifetime and never see a person killed. The illusion of invulnerability continues.
I believe people drive the way they live. The way most of us live is as if we're immortal. I believe we drive the same way. We have some basic, fundamental awareness that at any moment we could crash. And this tool that we're inside of could be turned against us. We keep that awareness under the surface so that we don't have to deal with the weight of it, and we drive as if we could never crash. And so when I see an accident, when I see other people injured in a terrible crash, I assume it's their fault. They caused it to happen to themselves. But that will never happen to me because I won't make that mistake. And after having weaved my way through the traffic jam and getting by the ambulances, I then breathe a sigh of relief, floor the accelerator, and speed away at 80 miles an hour.
We got a first serious accident in the morning as you're traveling southbound on Evergreen, coming right into the Detroit airport border. It's a rolled over van. Emergency crews have just arrived on the scene. All southbound lanes are blocked just before Ford.
A crash can be the result of a simple mistake, a misjudgment, a lack of concentration. but the punishment for that error can be severe.
I was going down a country road. Normally there's no cars on the roads anywhere. I came up to an intersection where there was a stop sign on my side, and there was another car coming from my right side, and they did not have a stop sign. They continued through the intersection, and so did I, and our front ends collided and we went off into a field.
Kenny broke his neck and is now paralyzed from the neck down. He missed the stop signs while driving on this Midwest American road. Kenny has no memory at all of the crash.
I got the police report, and I did, and I took my Polaroid camera, and I took some pictures. I thought maybe this would help Kenny jog his memory as to what happened. And the first picture I took was two yellow signs. So after I took the picture and I got back to the hospital, I showed Kenny, and he goes, that means there's going to be a stop sign ahead. So he knew, but he said, I missed those? I go, yeah, you missed that, I guess. So the next picture, as you approach the intersection, there's two stop signs. I mean, big ones that it's pretty hard, I would think, to miss them. So I keep thinking, how could Kenny miss that? Two big signs is pretty bad to miss. It doesn't appear that there was any braking at all, so I don't think these cars even saw each other till the last second, or the other driver thought, well, he's going to stop, and he didn't. But they had a pretty good impact. And it boils down to driver error, that you got young people driving cars that don't always know what's going on, I think, and that's what's the sad part.
He was an aggressive driver, I would say. I think he was a good driver, but I'd say he was pretty aggressive. That would be my evaluation, I think, of him.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I was very aggressive.
How?
I don't know, I would not stay in one lane and just go to where I'm going and just get there when I get there. I made sure I got there fast as I could. I would go around cars, and I was just very aggressive.
What'd you miss?
Everything, just the everyday stuff. I mean, all your friends go out, and maybe I can't get into someone's house because there's a step, or just holding hands, or there's just so many things that you don't even realize. Just when you're laying in bed and you're cold, you can sit up, cover yourself up, and lay back down, or your hand gets stuck up by your head and you can't even put it down. Just the littlest stuff that you don't realize how small it may be at the time, but when you can't do it, it's like, wow.
The appeal of driving is irresistible, almost built in. With a few driving lessons, we're ready for battle. If drivers cause crashes, perhaps they can be taught to drive better. High-performance drivers are seen as having higher skills than the rest of us. But is skill the answer?
When you're talking about the kind of skill which rally drivers feel they have to have, obviously that's different from the kind of skill which the average motorist will feel they have to have. But nevertheless, there is still this feeling that because you have passed a driving test, because you have got certain kinds of confidence and pride from doing that, that you know what's going on, you're the master, you're the boss. There's also a certain amount of emphasis on learning how to get out of trouble. However, the skills which you need to get out of trouble are very often precisely the skills that people use to get into trouble in the first place.
An American study looked at the accident rates of racing car drivers on public roads. Their crash rate was higher than ordinary drivers. High performance is not high safety. A number of other studies have been carried out into driver training, but there's no evidence that skill stops accidents.
go through the single cones. We're going to use hand-over-hand steering or a combination of shuffle steering. In and out, minimum of 20 miles per hour. Exit the last cone, pick up your speed.
Despite this investment in skill training, the New York police have a crash rate much higher than you would expect, even allowing for the nature of their job. 9 times higher than ordinary drivers.
Times, avoid accidents. When I say brake, hit them hard. And brake, use your ABS system to a full stop. That's the end of your test.
More skill is not the answer to crashes. Research carried out on drivers' eye movements over the last 20 years has shown that the way drivers see things may make crashes inevitable. Drivers are faced with a whole range of choices. Where they look may mean an accident or not.
We have a very wide area of vision, about 90 degrees on each side and a little less than that above and below. But only a very small part of that is accurate vision, about the size of a quarter held at arm's length. And that means that if we want to really look at something to see what's happening, to see if the pedestrian is starting to move across the street or to see if the light is turning red, we have to look right at the thing. When we film eye movements of drivers, we see that they fixate for a brief period of time and then zap, they fixate somewhere else, zap, fixate somewhere else. And each of those fixations takes about 1/3 of a second. And the reason that's a problem is that we are moving so quickly. We're moving at about 40 feet per second just in this city traffic area. And that means that in 1/3 of a second, we go this distance. I'll show you. And that's just to glance at the traffic light or glance at the pedestrian. Let's say we see something that makes us want to stop. Then we need perception reaction time. And during that time, just to get our foot on the brake, we travel this far. Okay, now we've got our foot on the brake, but we have to bring the car to a stop, and that takes about this distance. So you see, it's a very long distance just to respond to an unexpected event, the pedestrian that suddenly steps out in front of us.
Drivers are only one side of the crash story. There are others on the road.
More pedestrians are killed in New York City than drivers in crashes, and yet it's not talked about, it's not in the newspapers when a pedestrian is killed. So pedestrians are the forgotten part of crashes in New York City and even throughout America.
All right, let's do it, quick.
Once a month, a group of New York campaigners tours the streets, painting epitaphs to pedestrian deaths. In the city, 2/3 of pedestrian fatalities at crossings are when the lights are in the pedestrian's favor. Across America, the equivalent of 20 jumbo jet loads of pedestrians die each year.
It seems that every time a child is run over by a car, it's said that he or she darted out into the car, and the driver had no time to react. Well, if the driver had been going only 10 miles an hour instead of 30, or if the driver knew that there would be terrible consequences for him if he ran into a kid and injured a kid, then the drivers would exercise more restraint, and we wouldn't have car crashes being the #1 cause of death among people in America under the age of 14.
Catherine Vaccarello and her 2 daughters were killed by a car. After a family reunion in New York, Kathy, her husband John, and the 2 children walked to the junction to cross the road. A car shot the lights at 72 miles an hour. John was knocked unconscious. Conchetta, his daughter, was thrown 50 feet onto the pavement. Maria was scooped up into the windscreen. Kathy, John's wife, was trapped under the car. The driver is now in prison serving 3 life sentences for murder.
He never stopped. He went for 180 feet with my baby right next to him because she broke the windshield. And she was with the flower in her hand, that's what they told me. He carried her for about 180 feet, and my wife was underneath the car. And he couldn't steer the car. That's why he stopped. He went against the pole. That's what they told me. That's why we'll never forgive him. There's nothing else that allows murder. That was plain murder. There was no accident. If anybody come at me with a gun or a knife and try to harm what's mine, which is my family, I will fight like a lion. I can't fight a car that big or that small. I can't.
We build safer cars and safer roads, but there are still crashes, and the figures are rising. Why? Research points to a dangerous possibility. The drivers actually like to take risks.
I believe there's risk in just about every aspect of our lives, and particularly so on the road. Taking a risk is doing something that carries with it the probability of an adverse outcome. So if enough people take enough risks, there will be, inevitably, there will be accidents.
The emergency services are constantly practicing for the effects of risk-taking on the roads. Research suggests that each driver has their own level of acceptable danger and that they will drive up to that limit. If cars and roads are made safer, people will simply drive more dangerously.
I believe everyone has in their heads a risk thermostat. Some have them set very high, your Hell's Angel racing car driver perhaps. Others have them set very low, your archetypal timid and cautious little old lady. So we all take risks. Every time you get into a car, you are potentially risking your life, whether you're going to do the weekly shopping or get to the dentist or get to the church on time. Depending on the importance of getting there on time, you're likely to take more risks or fewer. And then if the setting of the thermostat gets out of balance with our perception of safety or danger, then there's a behavioral response that reestablishes the level of danger that we were originally content with. So, for example, if you fit a car with better brakes and there's no adjustment to the setting of the thermostat, then people drive faster, start braking later. The potential safety benefit gets consumed as a performance benefit.
Engineers and safety experts are concerned that this disregard of danger is undermining their efforts to protect drivers. Risk theory contradicts the idea that a tougher car will keep you alive longer on the road. After Jeeps and Range Rovers, the ultimate four-wheel drive has arrived. The Hummer was built for the United States military to use in war. It's now engaged in the battle of the roads.
People manufacture and purchase cars with all kinds of newfangled safety equipment. And this car is another example of a machine that superficially looks like an immortality apparatus. If we were to assume that everybody in the United States had a vehicle like this one, what would happen? Now, undoubtedly, people are better protected in the sense that given they have a collision at a certain speed, certain miles per hour, the chances of surviving would be greater. There's no question about that. But what would happen as a result? People would, in the first place, be tempted to drive a little faster because they now know that they're better protected. Secondly, they would also be tempted to drive more. And especially they would be tempted to drive more under adverse weather conditions now that they know they're better protected. So, in fact, the car manufacturer offers a way to the driver to protect himself or herself from the consequences of bad driving. And to protect people from the consequences of risky behavior is to provoke risky behavior.
The potential for things going wrong keep increasing. And yet our own sense of belief is that because we've got more technology, things are going to be better. Technology's got a hidden price, that as cars become more complicated and more efficient and more comfortable, drivers start to kind of lose their driving intelligence. So the sense of protection and invulnerability that we get from the car really turns us into quite dangerous people. You know, we're people who feel like we're not going to get hurt, and we're in charge of a big, powerful object.
What they should have, instead of an airbag there, is a spike or a bayonet coming out of the middle of the steering wheel. I bet you'd drive a lot more careful now if you had a spike sticking out there, wouldn't you? You could put the petrol tank in the front of the car where the bumper is there. I bet you drive a lot more careful then if you knew that that's where your petrol was. So we're building safer cars, but it's not improving the driving.
Imagine two cars that are identical in all respects, but one of them is a hypothetically perfect safe car. If you crash it, nothing happens. No metal is bent, nobody's hurt, no bad consequences occur. And the other car is wired up with dynamite, so that the first time you hit anything, no matter how gently, it generates a massive explosion. Now, feedback is the notion that drivers would not drive these cars in an identical manner. And I think most people would agree, although we haven't empirical data, that people would drive these differently. And they would drive them differently even if the cars were in fact identical, but they believed that one of them you couldn't get hurt in, and the other you would get massively hurt on first impact. Now, clearly, there are not vehicles that vary by this much in real traffic, but every safety intervention places a vehicle somewhere slightly different on that spectrum from the incredibly dangerous to the incredibly safe.
The road brings out the worst in us. Driving becomes a way of expressing personalities and rights. Trucks, buses, cars, bikes and pedestrians fight for space and make their own rules.
If we stop for lights, it's going to slow us down a lot. It's going to mess up the rhythms. That's why we just take the light and just keep going, keep going. Pedestrians, they're not going to wait when there's no traffic coming through. The light could be green, and it says don't walk, and then they just see a bike coming. They're not going to respect it. They're just going to keep crossing, and all of a sudden you just see like a crowd of ants just coming, just crossing the street trying to get the sugar, just going right through. And then what happens? We end up just screaming at them or just try to dodge through it, and boom, 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 and that's it, like that.
Just in general, the trucks hate the cab drivers. And one cab driver doesn't like the other guy, and they're all cutting each other off, and they're all a bundle of messes. Look at this guy. See this guy? Illegal. Went through the light. You got him? Okay. Illegal. No patience. And this guy's not going to signal over here, but he owns the road. And if you would signal, I might give you the right of way. But since you drive like a jerk, I don't want to give you nothing because you don't signal. That's my main thing of being out here. So if somebody's out there that's not signaling, I'm going to cut him off. I don't care if he likes it or not.
Driving is a relatively new skill for human beings. Carl Benz, co-founder of Mercedes-Benz, said in 1901 that no more than 1 million people throughout the world would ever be able to learn to drive. Now, everybody is an expert.
You know a person that drives with two hands. Right away, he's a dangerous driver. There you go. Two hands on the wheel. Dangerous, dangerous. Very, 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 very non-relaxed. He doesn't know where to go, either the right lane or left lane, swerving back and forth. Turn the wheel to the right, turn the wheel to the left, turn the wheel to the right, turn the wheel to the left. And either he's fast or slow, but he hits the brake like he'll kill somebody behind you. God rest his soul. Goodbye.
I just avoided some terrible accident there now. The guy came out of his lane and, well, encroached in my own lane. And I just, I was able to avoid that. I mean, I see a lot of things like that happening all the time, but thanks again for my good, for my wealth of driving experience.
Driving task is actually quite interesting. You're processing huge amounts of information all at the same time, without even knowing that you're doing it. Sometimes you think back, how did I do this journey? You don't remember traffic lights that you went through, you can't remember the people who you let pass, you can't remember anything about the whole trip. The reason for this is that you are having to do hundreds of things all at the same time. So you go into a kind of autopilot. So the whole idea of driving like this is actually quite alarming, but we do it every day and every week without even thinking about it.
I have not been involved in any other accident, and I have not caused no accident by myself, which is pretty good, and I hope to maintain that record by God's grace. My advice to people is that if it's unavoidable that they have to drive every day of their life,
I guarantee you when he gets to the journey's end, he won't even remember having done that. Yet we do this every day, every time when we drive. Things like this happen because we're on autopilot.
Okay, notice police station on the right here, how careful people are driving now. Are you only a good driver when there's a policeman following you? Or when you've seen a bad accident, you're good for a good. You drive properly for a good 20 minutes, don't you?
Hey, that's a good one, eh? Oh my God.
You're not going to believe this. I was doing 31 miles an hour then. Just slipped over by a mile. You just got to have that 100% concentration all the time. The ultimate driver, even that could happen to me, you see.
There are safe drivers on the roads, but when it comes to who lives and dies, other factors come into the equation. The odds are not always equal.
The driver of a light vehicle is about twice as likely to be killed as is the driver of a very heavy vehicle when you average it over all crashes. Now, if you think of a very extreme case in which the heavy vehicle and the light vehicle crash into each other, in that case, the driver of the lighter vehicle is 13 times as likely to be killed as is the driver of the heavier vehicle.
Tony Coletti experienced the truth of these statistics on a road in North London when his 2.25-ton Rolls-Royce struck a Ford Escort.
It was a nice sunny day, lovely day for driving. I entered a road called Alma Road, which is a dual carriageway. There's a slight incline, and as I reached the top of the incline, I noticed a car parked at 150 yards ahead of me on the left. Nothing unusual. I signalled. I moved out into the outer lane of the dual carriageway. I was doing at the time around about 38, and as I got within, I can only describe it as yards, this car just, from the near side position, did a 90-degree turn in front of me. I braked. The car just seemed like it floated, and I struck the other car on the driver's side door. I struck him about there, and I finished up on that island there.
At less than 40 miles an hour, the other car was demolished, the driver killed outright, and the Rolls-Royce a write-off.
Precisely what the other guy done. I remember seeing the shape of his head, and that was it. And then it was just an almighty explosion. Afterwards, when I saw the car, I couldn't believe the damage that my car could do at that speed. It really shook me, it really did.
He didn't have a chance, did he?
Absolutely none, no.
Did you ever think that you would end up killing somebody?
No, it's, I find it difficult at the moment to come to terms with because I feel that I've killed somebody. I don't even know who he is. I've never seen him. I don't know him. And I can't explain how, but it just bothers me in a way that I just can't. I feel I need to do something, but I really didn't know what to do. It just leaves you with a feeling that I can't explain. It's not a good one. It's just a horrible feeling.
On the roads, the odds are stacked against drivers. Abilities, attitudes, vehicles, and the sheer energy of the forces at work all conspire to make driving the most dangerous activity in daily life.
When I trained as a young engineer, road design standards were absolute things, and they were often argued on grounds of safety. If you make a bend less steep, you offer a safety benefit. What over the years we have learned, and I have learned, is that if you make the bend less sharp, drivers go around it faster. Some of that safety benefit that we think we're offering them gets taken up by higher speed.
The road itself gives you information. Studies have been done that show that for every foot you make a lane wider, people will increase the speed by an average of about 3 miles per hour. The same thing holds for, say, edge markings. If there are clear edge markings along a road, people will drive faster. There have been studies to indicate that sometimes improved edge markings actually lead to an increase of the accident rate of the roads in question.
Most people would intuitively think that the fatality risk must be lower when the roads are dry, compared to in winter when they are covered with snow ice and a greater chance of water. The reverse turns out to be very dramatically and clearly the case. In the United States, the fatality rate is substantially lower in February than it is in the mid-summer months. It follows a very clear cyclical pattern. Year after year, people reduce their speed, and it's speed that has a very large influence on the outcome of a crash.
Drivers cause crashes, and speed has a part in every crash. Regardless of speed limits, the thrill of acceleration and the obsession with getting there make a volatile and illegal combination.
Wilhelm Ida, St. Type Y, 490, ein Opel Kadett auf der Innenspur.
Speeding, however, is still not regarded by most drivers as road crime.
I think it's probably unrealistic to pretend that most drivers want to go at a reasonable speed. Throughout recorded history, we know that value has been placed on the fastest runner, the fastest horse, the fastest ship, the fastest train, the fastest car, the fastest plane. In that regard, it would probably make more sense to make cars that feel as if they're speeding, you know, at 70 or 80 miles an hour when they're going only 40, but instead we do just the opposite. We make cars that feel as if they're practically standing still when they're doing 70 or 80. But the problem is that we're not built to withstand the sudden stop when anything happens.
I love speed, and I love the performance of the cars. And I always go more or less, if possible, to the limits of these cars.
On some German autobahns, you can drive as fast as you dare. This man does over 200 miles an hour on public roads, legally. But the higher the speed, the greater the risk of crashing, the greater the severity of the injuries.
People on an average road, they do, let's say, 100, and I always have the feeling that they fell asleep because this kind of speed is not taking their attention so much. So they are playing with their mobile phones, they're playing with their radios. I don't know, maybe they are reading newspapers, I don't know. But if you drive a very real high performance cars, you are fully concentrated on what you're doing. And I think the problem are the other people on the road.
To deal with an alarming fatality rate on motorways, the Germans in the 1970s developed a helicopter rescue system to lift off the severely injured and speed them to the local hospital. Modern medicine is at hand to hold the road fatality rate down. The helicopters are paid for not by the health authorities, but by the drivers' organization, the German Automobile Association.
The whole purpose of the highway transportation system is mobility. The primary purpose is not safety. We clearly are willing to pay a certain safety price in order to achieve the mobility. The question is, where is the appropriate balance? For example, if we had strictly enforced speed limits of 25 miles per hour, I don't think there's any question that we could reduce deaths and injuries on the highway. We don't do that because that reaches the point where it's interfering too severely with the whole purpose of mobility. On the other hand, when we're having vehicles going down the highway at 65 and 70 and 75 and 80 miles per hour, we're going beyond the boundaries of the kind of protection that can be provided to the occupant.
You can see where she yawed and she hit the wall right here. Those are her marks of her scraping the wall. The walls on the freeways here are designed to keep people from going through the wall into other traffic. It'll bring the car back over. You can see where she hit right here. She hit again up here, and then she came down, and that's where she ended up over there.
There is this idea that the benefits of mobility and using cars are such and so large that the penalties or the disbenefits can be accepted. So that the economic gains from lots of mobility, the industry making cars, servicing cars, all those things are so wonderful that a few deaths on the side don't really matter.
We gotta know if it's a rollover or not.
The answer to this cost-benefit approach is very, very simple, very straightforward. The whole argument immediately evaporates when we talk about an individual experience. If the person making the argument loses a child or a partner in a road traffic accident, dead, killed on the road, then all the benefits in the world in no way come anywhere near to compensating for one death.
Rollover, ISP, palpated blood pressure 78, pulse rate 108.
Reuben.
What happened, Reuben? Huh?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. You allergic to anything?
No.
Drivers keep hospitals fully employed. Car crashes are now the main causes of brain and spinal injury.
Get another IV in.
Second one over here. You want the ID? It's right there.
There's a kind of horror that happens in a car crash. The car is something we love. It's an extension of us.
About 45 miles an hour on liver noise.
Suddenly, one day, we lose control. The car isn't responding.
Struck another car. Okay. We gotta go down.
It's sliding, skidding. We're approaching a tree, approaching another vehicle.
And breathing. The steering wheel was bent up and to the right, and the windshield was scarred. Okay.
One way to think about it is, imagine a carpenter who has a favorite hammer that they love, that always works perfectly, and suddenly, while they're holding it in their hand, it begins to pound them in the head. An automobile during a crash is not so different from that. It's a machine that turns against us and capitalizes on our own frailty. It's almost as if it's eating us alive.
However much drivers try to protect themselves, people will still die by their own foolishness or the recklessness of others. The police, emergency services, and governments will all try to stem the tide and will all, at times, seem to be winning the battle. But the lethal combination of car and driver is hard to beat.
Every year, the official road safety establishment and the motor manufacturers tell us that things are getting better because the total number of fatalities goes down a little bit. In fact, if you look at other figures, if you look at the total insurance claims, which doubled in the 1980s alone, if you look at the number of reported casualties, which have increased by 100,000 since the 1950s, if you look at all those figures, you see that the common sense judgment of people who've lived through the last 40 years, which is that the road environment is now more dangerous, is in fact, I'm afraid, correct.
Around the world, every year, 500,000 people die on the road. Approximately 1 person in 200 of the world's population dies from the result of injuries suffered in a road crash. Drivers are the problem and the solution. The will to drive continues. Just 14 months after being paralyzed in a crash, Kenny wants to get back on the road.
Tell me if you see a light flashing.
He's taken the tests to prove that his responses are fast enough, that his senses can cope with the return to driving.
The bottom one?
With patience, he's getting there.
The top one.
Okay, Ken, I want you to just turn the wheel to the right, and I'll try to turn the wheel. Give it a little bit of gas. Push forward. Turn the wheel. That's great. Go the other way now. A little bit more gas.
The final program in the series will be shown in 2 weeks' time. Next Sunday evening, as part of a weekend of political programs, Rory Bremner takes a satirical look at New Labour. The Blair Essentials are at 9 o'clock. A man who knows too much is forced to run for his life next on 4 in our movie premiere, Heaven's Prisoners.
When choosing your car, size isn't always everything.
There's plenty of room inside, and it really does ooh.
At midnight tonight. Now on 4, piecing together what happened in the final part of Crash.
Rescue Box 4881, Battalion 3, Engine 281, Paramedic 3, EMS 3, respond for a motor vehicle accident. I-97 North, near Crownsville Road.
A Mercedes, the wrong side of an American freeway. Inside it, a dead man. Every day around the world, 2,000 people are killed in accidents like this one in Maryland, USA. Today, when crashes like this occur, it's up to a new kind of investigator, the car crash detective, to come up with the answer to the first question everyone asks. What happened?
What happened? Well, that's what we're here to find out. What happened? From our first impressions, it appears that the Mercedes was traveling southbound. The driver lost control, skidded across the median strip, and was then struck by a northbound vehicle. The driver was traveling north. They were just presented with a vehicle sliding across the road in front of them. There was nothing they could do to avoid the collision. The witnesses that we have so far only saw the vehicle out of control. None were able to determine why this car lost control. We know why he died of his injuries. It was massive trauma because the impact was directly on the driver's door. The only question we have is why did the driver of the Mercedes leave the road? And that's what we're going to try to determine, why he left the road.
No two accidents are alike, but they all have certain things in common. They're not chance events. They have reasons and rules, and they leave a trail of forensic evidence. Some of those who collect that evidence are policemen with arrests and prosecutions in mind.
Was that down like that already, or have they pressed it down?
Others work for insurance companies and lawyers, seeking to establish innocence or guilt. But many are just academics and civil servants who have no interest in apportioning blame, only in finding out how to stop people dying on our roads.
Accidents don't normally have single causes. They're combinations of things. The most common factor is some human error of some kind in about 90% of accidents. In about 50%, there's something wrong with the highway design. And only in about 5 or 6% is there some contribution from the vehicle in terms of causing accidents. And these come together so that most of the time there are at least 2 contributing factors. You very seldom get a single cause accident.
Here, it was the design of the highway and inexperience that led to the death of a young man on this country road in Maryland. Reading the clues left on the roadside enables an experienced investigator to put together those last few seconds of the driver's life.
As the vehicle starts into the curve, he moves forward and up and out with the center of gravity, which will actually force him out or to the apex of the curve. As we move along here, you'll see, as we get closer and closer to the edge, that there's actually a lip on the edge of the road. This is where he really starts into a problem area, because the vehicle itself is going to want to follow right along the edge of the side of the road, almost like a car on a track. As he keeps moving down through here, what's running through his mind right now is, how do I get this vehicle back up onto the roadway? This is where the left front wheel starts to come back onto the roadway again. This is where the driver's made a real hard cut to the right. At this point, he's starting to get into real trouble. What happens is, once this wheel comes back on, the 2 wheels aren't coming one behind the other at this point. As he's coming on, this is where the left rear wheel starts coming on. And what ends up happening is the car has now started into a clockwise rotation. You can tell from looking at the marks on the roadway that the vehicle's equipped with snow tires. You can see the hard chink marks across here, which are from the snow tires, the edges of the snow tires marking. What's happening is he's actually loading the very edges of the tire, because as he's spinning around, leading with his left-hand side, he's moving further and further toward his peril. As the left wheels hit the ditch, it's going to start a tripping action on the vehicle. As the vehicle trips, he starts making contact with the ground. And you can see spots in the ground now where he's plowed his way through, headed to final rest. This Jeep is probably equipped with a soft top, because we're seeing just minor marks as he's coming up and through. He finally ends up coming to rest over here. The bad news is this driver never had a seatbelt on. At that point, without the seatbelt on, going through those rolling actions that he's gone through, he's been partially ejected at this point. And as he's partially ejected, he's rolling with the vehicle, because he'll stay again, moving at the same masses as what the vehicle moves at, and he's wrapping up with it. As he comes to rest, face down on the ground with the Jeep on top of him. What we do know at this point is that he died of asphyxiation. What we don't know is whether the asphyxiation is a result of the burning and the breathing smoke around him, or what probably happened is, with this guy face down in the dirt and a 2,000-pound Jeep sitting on top of him, he's not going to be able to breathe. So this is where this 26-year-old male loses his life, right here on this spot.
"30 years ago, no one investigated accidents. They just happened. The police filed a report, and that was that. Until pioneers in Britain and the United States came up with a whole new approach.
When I first got started, the basic ways that people knew about accidents came from police reports and from insurance company records. And I thought it would be a good way to do research to actually go and look at crashes. And that was a new idea at the time. It came actually from aviation. Aircraft accident investigation was much more advanced at that time. And I learned a lot of the things about crash investigation by following some of the big crash investigations that were done on air disasters in Britain. I spent time rebuilding aircraft and learning about how you analyze structures, how you look for contact between occupants and structures and so on. So I recruited some people. I had a surgeon and a psychologist and a highway engineer, and I was a vehicle engineer. So we looked at accidents in a very broad brush, comprehensive way involving all those 4 disciplines. We went to the scenes of crashes within 30 minutes or so of their occurrence and collected information, photographed everything we could see, measured the scenes, and developed detailed crash investigation techniques.
We first looked for the very obvious things. Was the interior of the car deformed, crushed? Was the space available to the occupant compromised in some way? We'll look for scuff marks, for blood, for hair transfers. Perhaps there'll be some dents in the instrument panel where someone's knees impacted. So these, again, there are little pieces to a puzzle, but it's not until we sit down and look at all the evidence that we can come up with really definitive answers.
The first thing we do is usually start with an exterior inspection where we document the damage that's on the outside of the car, the scratches, the size of the dents, and where those scratches and dents are to tell us the picture of what occurred within that crash. The energy it took to do this is probably only about 15 to 17 miles per hour to do this much damage. This Chrysler-built minivan we can learn quite a bit from. It more than likely on its rollover rolled over on an expressway or on some kind of macadam. You can see the heavy gouging moves in more than one direction. This vehicle had to have come from its wheels to this sheet metal at least 4 times. So judging by the amount of damage on this, this was a high-speed, severe rollover. The speeds involved in this crash are probably only in the 35 to 40 mile an hour range. The difference is that it's striking a very hard and heavy object that's absorbing little or no energy. Most of the energy in this crash is being absorbed by this particular vehicle. What's interesting about this is as the force is being applied this way, the unbelted occupants inside this vehicle are moving sideways up against the interior components, and you can see how it's bulged the actual passenger compartment out from loading as a result of not being belted inside the car. The damage on the steering wheel in this car will tell us quite a bit. This occupant was more than likely not belted. But basically, the occupant has moved straight forward, loading the bottom side of the rim both upwards and forward. More than likely, this occupant was killed instantly because of the fact that there's no blood inside the vehicle. Once the person's killed instantly, they won't bleed anymore inside the vehicle.
Well, in the United States, there are well over 2 million crashes a year, and we kill 40,000 people. Even though, as a society, we've somewhat accepted that risk, we don't worry about car crashes the way we do about airplane crashes. We think of them as crashes, not accidents. There really are factors that cause these crashes, and more importantly, factors that cause injuries. So the importance for us of investigating crashes such as this is to try and prevent those crashes and to reduce or to eliminate the injuries that occur to the drivers and the occupants.
If there's one place where they need the skills of a car crash detective, it's here. This is the most dangerous road in Europe. You're 7 times more likely to lose your life here than on any road in Britain or America. The N125 stretches for 150 kilometers across the Algarve of southern Portugal, and every black spot on this map represents another cluster of lives lost this year.
I think this road is famous here in Portugal. The 125, everybody knows it.
A friend of us, but he died because he was too speedy in this road, over there, in the crossroads. I think it was about 160 or 80. And there was this truck, this big, huge truck, which just crossed the road, and then he just crashed with the truck. Because it was too big, too long.
Pedestrians are always at risk on the N125. Along with motorcyclists, they make up almost half the casualties on the road. Anyone trying to find the reason for this appalling death rate would hardly know where to begin. The Portuguese driver may be one factor. On paper, they have the worst accident record in the world. Portugal is a youthful nation and has more younger, inexperienced drivers than most, and it shows.
They consider as the first cause of the accidents the behavior of the drivers, of course, of the other drivers. Generally, the people consider themselves an excellent driver, and each driver consider themselves an angel surrounded by a lot of devils causing them enormous problems.
Driver behavior is clearly a factor. There are many others. One is the schizophrenic nature of the road itself. From being a modern four-lane highway, it suddenly plunges between the houses and market squares of ancient towns, only to re-emerge between open fields where the temptation to speed again puts pedestrians in mortal danger.
It's the example of a road who should not exist.
But the N125 exists as the feeder road to every beach on the Algarve. And that's another problem. In the summer months, the body count rises dramatically. In August, the population of the region increases from 400,000 to 2.5 million overnight as holidaymakers flood into the area. Business is brisk at the many car rental firms that stand beside the road as English, German, and American tourists are bussed in from the airport. Few of them have a clue about the danger which lurks only feet away. Little idea that the road they're about to join has an annual death rate of 1 person killed every 1,000 meters. Neither do they seem to notice the 30 or 40 freshly wrecked hire cars beside the building. Why should they? They're on holiday after all. It's the job of the Transit Brigade to police the traffic problems of the Algarve. In August, reinforcements are drafted in from as far away as Lisbon to help out their beleaguered colleagues on the road. Theirs is an exercise in futility, like trying to hold back the tide. Speed traps and random breath tests are employed around the clock. The accidents continue. Nothing is learned, nothing is gained.
Continue, continue sempre, sempre, sempre. Continue, continue.
Almost all the drivers are over the limit. They get a £40 fine. As dawn breaks, the Transit Brigade finds itself once again mopping up the debris.
It's very bad.
The N125 could be the ultimate real-life road crash laboratory. The trouble is that there are no research scientists around to study the data and draw the conclusions. In Portugal, there are no road crash detectives. This is the most familiar image of car crash testing. It's exciting, it's dramatic. But it has one serious flaw, say the investigators. It's not how accidents happen in the real world. When it comes to finding out why cars crash, there's no substitute for real life. In the detective's book, something like this is always called a crash, never an accident.
It used to be an accident. These days, at least in the research community, it's most definitely a crash. If you assume it's an accident, we throw our hands up and we all go home because nothing can be done. But a crash is an event, and an event always has factors which lead to that event.
Dennis, what do we got here?
Well, we first thought it was a single vehicle versus fixed object, but now after we arrived on the scene, we found out that there was a second vehicle involved. We've got a minor side swipe, and then the victim careened off the right side of the roadway, took out 4 of those concrete fence posts, and wound up over in a field. He was airlifted to Jackson, extremely critical. He had some concrete cinder blocks that came right through the windshield that hit him in the face.
On the operating table is Andrew Goff, a middle-aged salesman from Miami. All that's known at this stage is that he's had a collision with another car, mounted the curb, and crashed.
Most of his injuries from the crash itself came from blocks. It appears blocks went through the windshield.
He suffered very severe lacerations of the scalp and also a very severe open depressed fracture of the skull, with fragments of bone actually going in and lacerating the surface of the brain.
We can see that fire cut him out, and this is a normal thing they do instead of trying to, they're in such a rush to save him.
At this time, we're literally cleaning out the bone pieces, and we're removing areas of brain that are not survivable, that are irreversibly damaged. And then what we'll try to do is to cover over the surface of the brain with the dura, or the membrane that normally covers it. If we can't close the patient's own membrane, what we'll do is we'll take a piece of cadaver membrane and close it over as a graft. And that'll hopefully reduce the risk of infection.
He might have lost control over there, but he must have been braking from out there. Yeah.
As the surgeons attempt to save Andrew Goff's life, crash investigators from the Metro-Dade Police Department soon discover that this was no ordinary collision.
I saw all these cars getting out of the way. There was like pandemonium behind me. Then I saw the little red car coming up, and he was swerving in and out of traffic trying to avoid the cars. Was he speeding? He was going at least, I would say, around 100.
We said, well, you know, is he crazy or something? And then he just kept like avoiding all the cars and going through from one lane. We were in the 3rd lane here. And he went to this lane, then he went to the next lane, then he came back. And we thought he was going to crash for sure, because my husband said he's going to kill somebody.
There's lots of hard evidence that the car was traveling at high speed and out of control, swerving in and out of traffic, hitting the curb, seemingly unable to stop. But why?
Okay. Yeah, he really can't see where he's come up anywhere, but
no. This could be the initial hit coming up on this side.
Over a mile from where the car eventually crashed. If they can find out where the accident started, they may be able to work out why.
Looks flat here.
He also has contusions or bruises of the brain on the opposite side, and when we have injuries such as this, where both sides of the brain are injured, the prognosis for a good recovery really plummets quite a bit, and his chances for a good recovery are extremely small.
See right here? He closed his tire right here.
Yeah, it's new. Yeah, brand new. Yes, sir. Whenever you can scrape the concrete off or the rubber, then it's
see that?
It's fresh. It's brand new.
See that rubber right there? That's fresh.
So he's come on and off the curb all the way down the road. We may walk back another mile.
Look at this.
They're losing the battle at the hospital, but back at the scene, the detectives think they may have the answer.
It looks like he's probably had a seizure. Or
it's got the ear marks.
How old is our victim?
I don't know.
We need to find out.
That's what we need to find out.
5713045. 5713045.
I have that feeling, that gut feeling, that he's driving down the road and he had some sort of a physical seizure. and just continued on.
Lighter trauma.
Because it's obvious he was bouncing off the curb and mounting the curb on and off, on and off.
17, white male in his 40s.
In his 40s, well, that's prime time for heart. This is our man. But neighbors said that he has no visitors, no next of kin.
It happened right near his house, too.
A paper bag found in the car appears to prove their theory. It contains medication.
Do you know what type of medication this is?
That is medication given for seizure disorders.
The crash detectives have had a success, but Andrew Goff never regained consciousness and died of his brain injuries 12 days later. The investigation of real-world crashes has led to some startling statistics as to where and why we are likely to die in a road traffic accident. For instance, in the United States, the thing most likely to kill you is a tree. 19-year-old Chris Morris of Glen Burnie, Maryland, almost became a statistic himself when his Mustang hit a tree at this spot early one morning in a spectacular crash that left more questions than it answered.
It's just one of those bad days. Should have stayed in bed.
Senior crash detective Doug Davis has been called in. He highlights the telltale clues. But his investigation reveals a discrepancy. Just who is telling the truth?
Because of the lack of residual scene evidence, it would have to be estimated that the young man lost control of the vehicle just before the break in the double yellow line.
From the time I lost traction to the time I hit the tree couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 seconds. I didn't really have time to think.
Lose control, and yaw left. Yawing left, he comes straight.
I knew whatever I was going to do wasn't going to stop it from what was going to happen was going to happen.
Overcorrects. The car begins a right side leading slide.
I pretty much just let go of everything and let it flow after I lost control.
Comes across the driveway, left wheel and the right wheel, and the front of his front door impacts the tree.
Just before I hit the tree, I blacked out. That was the last thing I remember, and I woke up in the trunk.
But the tree caused him to become airborne. His front facing this way, he rotated counterclockwise in the air. And the vehicle landed. At this point,
I woke up in the trunk and sat there for what seemed to me about a half hour. It's probably actually 5 to 10 minutes at the most. I didn't hurt anybody or anything. I had no idea where I was. So I crawled out of the car. As I crawled out of the car, I could see the woman that had called the ambulance. And she looked like she had seen a ghost, or couldn't believe she had seen me crawling out of the car.
on the inside of the car, as the car hit the tree and this side intruded, the front seat has been folded more than in half. The brake and the clutch pedal and the accelerator are hidden behind this. Quite fortunate that he didn't have his feet entrapped, or that this didn't roll over on his feet and break bones or amputate. It would appear that he was projected to the right and rearward, and his head would have been somewhere possibly in this area. We have a blood mark right here. There's a small blood mark right here.
Only thing that was going through my mind was I was happy to be alive.
It would appear from the inspection of the seatbelt that he was not wearing his seatbelt at the time of the crash. When a person wears a seatbelt, we find scratches where the seatbelt is going into the latch plate. This, I would say, it probably hasn't been buckled more than 10 or 20 times in its life.
I don't know why I didn't wear my seatbelt. I just woke up, didn't even get a shower. Was in my car 5 minutes after I woke up.
We also look for melting. When it tightens up, it runs very quickly past this plastic. We find melted pieces at the edge. This belt was not worn during the crash.
In the detective's reconstruction, Chris Morris was traveling north along the road when the crash occurred.
You know, there's really no reason for this kid to have lost control of this car. There's no defects in the road. It would appear to me that he might have been downshifting. Behind us is a double curve and a hill. And the young man lives in this neighborhood. He knows the road. And it would seem that he probably was slowing down or preparing to come through this curve, and through lack of experience, he just lost control of the car as he downshifted. Very bad mistake. Lack of experience.
Chris Morris agrees that he was changing gear when he lost control, but that's when their stories differ. He claims that he was leaving his parents' home early in the morning to go to work when the accident occurred. So according to him, he was traveling south.
Okay, I was coming over the hill right here. Just before the 3 mailboxes, I started shifting from 3rd to 4th. If the RPMs get up there, it'll spin the wheels and cause you to break traction. That's what I was trying to avoid, but it happened anyway.
He was traveling north. There's no way he could hit the tree with the right side of his car by going south. Had he been going south, he would have gone off the other side of the road and he would not have hit a tree.
If the investigator is right, then the young man is concealing the fact that he'd been out all night and that he was actually returning home in the early morning when the crash occurred.
I was pretty heartbroken to lose the car. I'll work on getting another one, though.
In Britain, this constable from Birmingham is the police force's top crash expert.
65 miles an hour, 70, and slam the brakes on it. It doesn't matter how much we steer, we'll still brake in a relatively straight line.
Unlike aircraft, most cars don't carry a black box. Instead, the investigator often has to rely upon the marks left upon the road. As distinctive as fingerprints, each one tells a story. And in his search for the correct result, Doyle literally leaves no stone unturned.
Here we are at an interesting point in the skid mark, where we've got evidence of characteristic road grinding, which is this line along the skid mark with a stone at the end of it. This road grinding helps us to determine the direction of travel of the vehicle and shows definitely the vehicle was travelling in that direction.
Doyle returns to the skid pan every week for his own education. He works closely with another expert, a tyre consultant who's called upon in cases all over the world. To Rex Grogan, every tyre is unique. For a start, the tyre treads are all still made by hand.
We're talking about handmade tyres, and here's an example of what happens if the manufacturer doesn't get it quite right. What we're looking at here is through the tread, x-raying through the tread. If we look at the distance of the belt edge from this marked centre line here, we can see that it's quite a bit wider on that side than it is on this side. Pretty obviously the tyre should be symmetrical about that centre line. But this guy got it wrong. He just didn't make it properly. And so this tyre is trying to pull the vehicle round a corner that isn't there all the time. Very exciting motoring.
Birmingham, one September evening. Science is one thing. The real world of car crash detection is much more messy. It's the rush hour, it's getting dark, and they're racing against time to save the victim. 26-year-old Corinne Dowdy and a female friend are trapped in the wreckage of their silver Nissan. The passenger is freed first. She's 6 months pregnant. The baby's still alive. Corinne Dowdy has a smashed jaw, leg and arm.
the moment the crews are engaged in using the whole Matro hydraulic cutting equipment to extricate her, but you have to balance that with the needs of the paramedics. So it's cut, talk to the paramedics, let them do a little bit, they'll stabilise her, then we'll cut a bit more until eventually she's free from the wreckage and she can be transported into hospital. We'd like to get it all over and done with a maximum of 1 hour. It's known as the golden hour. During that time, the patient has a very good chance of survival. Most times, it's done very much quicker.
We've given her some pain-killing drugs in order to help the extrication process, and she should be released within the next 15 to 20 minutes, and should be taken to the major injuries unit at the trauma unit at Selly Oak. Her condition at the moment is quite poorly, but she is stable.
The question no one can yet answer is what caused Corinne to smash head-on into another car in daylight on a straight suburban road. Mike Doyle has arrived at the scene. For him, it's a race against time too. The evidence is disappearing before his eyes. His examination eventually reveals that a third vehicle may have been involved. Witnesses confirm this.
Essentially, the majority of the debris is just there anyway. There's a good debris scatter. It's a data collection process. That information is brought into this office, and then we will produce a plan.
Red paint.
Yeah, you've got gouges there.
Yeah.
You see this at the end?
Yeah.
Shows movement that way.
Yeah.
So we know that these marks have been caused by movement in this direction. Yeah. I've input the information from the accident scene, and now on the screen we can see the marks which we saw at the scene. If you take a look at this mark, we can see striations across it where the wheel's actually been rotating. Now we can see that that's the position, with the cursor moving around it, of the silver vehicle. And that's the position, with the cursor moving around it, of the red vehicle. So I know that this mark, this curved mark, has been left by a rotating wheel. The mark that we looked at a little while ago was left by a locked skidding wheel.
4 times I told you to move on, have you?
So this. What we've got evidence on this tyre is a set of marks scuffing across the tyre, showing that it's been dragged or moved sideways. You can possibly see there's also quite a deep tear in the tyre, right across, which is directly in line with the damage to the rim. We're now going to bring the rest of the image onto the screen. Now we can see the relationship between the road markings, the scuff marks and skid marks left by the vehicles, and the position of the vehicles. The point of impact was around here. The silver vehicle rotated off. The red vehicle was dragged and drawn across in this direction. What isn't shown on this is the third vehicle that we believe was involved. That didn't even stop, and that looks to have been the prime cause of this accident. Here we have the final animation of the scene that we visited, with the red car and the silver car travelling towards each other. We can see what happens to the vehicles in the collision. So there we have our final rendered image.
Corinne Dowdy, her friend and the baby all survived this accident. The mysterious third car has never been traced.
When you go out to these accidents, you can't become personally involved immediately. If we weren't impartial and completely professional, we'd miss things. The important thing is to make sure that we get the correct result at the end. The correct result is in technical terms, not in emotional terms, because none of these results are correct in that sense.
As a society, we seem to accept the potential risk of car crashes because we're in love with our cars. They provide us with mobility, with freedom, with control. They're stylish. They reflect who we think we are. And because we think we have control over the motor vehicles, we don't understand that these aren't just accidents that happen randomly. They actually are crashes that have antecedent factors. We're all terrified of a plane crash because someone else is in the driver's seat, not us. But of course, crashes do happen to all of us all the time.
A moment from our nightmares, trapped inside a crashed car, a horror many of us will experience in our lifetime.
My name's Steve, I'm a first aider, can you hear me? What's your name? John.
But the reality is we stand a much better chance of surviving something like this because of the knowledge gained through investigating real-life crashes.
So have you got any severe bleeding? Are you wet round the groin at all? Just keep your head as still as you can, okay, John? Keep it perfectly still. Some questions. I don't want you to nod your head. I want you to say yes or no.
In order to really understand the causes of injuries, it takes what we call a multidisciplinary effort, people from a variety of backgrounds working together. We've been very fortunate in the last 10 years in working with physicians such as the doctors up at Maryland Shock Trauma. They understand injury mechanisms. They understand what it takes to break a bone or to perforate a liver. We understand, of course, motor vehicle crashes.
This close liaison between crash detectives and surgeons means that it is now possible to predict just what kinds of injury patterns will occur in an accident.
If you're on the outboard side of a rollover and you end up getting the centrifugal force and the whiplash, even though you're well belted, you may end up with your head driven into the roof. But it's not the classic storytelling that some of our other crashes are, where you can look at a set of x-rays on a patient and turn around and speak to the ambulance or emergency medical provider and tell them what the car looked like.
Your fingers in your left hand for me. Your fingers in your right. Your tongue at all.
If the risks of death and serious injury are to be reduced still further, then we have to have a better understanding of exactly what happens to the person inside the car.
Raj, when you can, I want to do a secondary survey.
There are 3 collisions, and the first is the collision of the automobile with an object. And now a body, the pure model would be unrestrained, has a second collision with the inside of the automobile. And the third collision is the one where the injuries are truly caused, and that's the collision with the internal organs of the body, who then go forward and collide with the body wall. That's where the injury often truly occurs. It's in that third collision. There are also issues of pure intrusion, like parts of the car going into the body.
Are you married at all, John? No, you're not. You have a girlfriend? Okay, cutting style. All right. She wasn't in the car with you at all, was she? You were on your own, weren't you? I'll just try and check you over as much as I can. From your head to your toes, all right?
The injury patterns which occur in real-world crashes can't easily be duplicated in the laboratory. Crash test dummies are sophisticated and expensive, but when all's said and done, they're made of inflexible plastic. They don't behave like a real human being.
If you're caught completely off guard, you will replicate how many of the dummies are set up in the Vehicle Research Institute, sort of upright, 50th percentile dummy, standard weight, standard height.
Unfortunately, most of us have some feeling that a frontal accident is going to occur, and we tend to brace our lower extremities. The accident occurs, either the patient is launched forward or the toe pan and floorboard come towards him, and if I can use my shoe as a model for the whole foot, we find the foot laying up alongside the leg, and it told me a story. At the moment of impact, I was stuck, the foot somewhere, and the rest of the body bypassed me and exited the skin, collected the environment, and recoiled back a bit and came in, although usually the foot, in the worst cases, is here.
Got it. John, we're just going to bend your feet back, okay?
Okay,
Is that all right? Any discomfort, let us know.
All right, if you have any pain, let me know straight away.
By having that team with me, in other words, the person responsible for pulling that patient from the wreck, they would say yes. We had 25 minutes of extraction time at the scene, and it was because of just what you've described. That pattern recognition has brought itself from the clinician through the accident reconstruction back to the basic scientist, and hopefully the loop there continues to the automobile manufacturer, who either duplicates that in their own lab or takes the data at face value and changes the vehicle.
Injuries to the brain are the single greatest cause of death and disability in road traffic accidents. The injuries are caused when the brain is forced violently against the inside of the skull.
Just trying to keep that head in that neutral position all the time, okay, John? We don't want to move that head. Okay, keep it perfectly still.
The brain, unfortunately, when there's an impact, will continue to move. When that brain moves, there are various modes of deformation that occur in the brain. The brain actually distorts and moves, and those distortions and motions cause a variety of different injuries. If you consider a string between two plates, and you move the two plates apart, the string stretches. There are portions of the brain that actually end up moving apart like this, and those strings that stretch are the axons. They're the communicators between neurons, neural cells, and if that communication is lost, your thinking is lost, your function is lost. Sometimes you may get hit frontally, but the injury is in the back. The brain is suspended in a fluid, water-like fluid. When the brain moves away from the back of the skull, that fluid cavitates or effectively boils and creates bubbles. And these bubbles then collapse on the surface of the brain and actually pit the brain, put a hole in the brain, as you would with a hose of fast water into dirt. What we do is we try to understand the mechanisms of brain injury so that we can provide technology and science to help build safety restraints, seat belts and airbags.
All this research goes into improving the driver's chances. Ultimately, it's translated into safer cars. Investigators can point to their lasting achievements: seat belts, crumple zones, side impact bars, shatterproof glass, and the airbag.
And looking at the airbag, we see a beautiful lipstick print right here. We call it the kiss of life. We're assuming it was a woman because of the lipstick, although you can't always be sure even of that. But we could say she's probably a mid-sized woman and that she was in position, in a normal position at the time of the deployment because her face was approximately in the center of the airbag.
Since the airbags have been placed into the vehicles, we've seen a whole different kind of pattern. People are alive today that wouldn't normally be alive. So now instead of focusing on head and chest, severe trauma, we're now starting to look at extremity trauma, lower legs being fractured, and lower extremity fractures such as fractures of the femur into the hips, because the airbags are actually working and protecting the occupants.
Right, John, feel that fresh air. You'll be out in a 2 secs now, mate.
Okay, head in this neutral position.
Right, where do you want him to go? Out to you, Steve.
To slide out there, okay?
The extrication carried out by these firefighters has been a training exercise.
Okay, tell me everyone's ready.
Ready.
You all ready? Okay, John, on 3. 1, 2, 3, and slide. Okay, John. Just take
The methods used have only been developed because of the work of the car crash detective.
Okay, and rest and lay the casualty down.
People are as God made them, and very often worse than that. But the fundamental thing is that just because people cause accidents most of the time, it doesn't mean to say that the best way to prevent and diminish accidents is to try and do something about the driver. What you can do is make the highway system, make the highway design, the roadways better, make the vehicles better, and that way you have much better and more cost-effective solutions than the traditional attempts of trying to change behavior, which by and large have been shown to be a waste of money.
Back in Maryland, the police are wrapping it up. The dead man was Harry Axelrad, a 25-year-old investment broker. He lived nearby. Perhaps he was taking the bend too fast in the rain. Perhaps he was nudged by another vehicle. There are no clues, no eyewitnesses. Some cases remain a mystery, even to experienced detectives. For once, it's the police who are left asking, what happened?
The Earth is in constant motion and cannot...